Allora, benvenute, siamo molto contenti di ospitare qui alla Casa questo evento. La Casa, come sapete, insomma, è il luogo non solo storico ma simbolico del femminismo. Qui c'è la storia delle lotte delle donne, del protagonismo delle donne, ma non solo delle lotte, ma anche del pensiero delle donne. Come sapete il femminismo dagli anni 70 in poi, questa casa nasce da un'occupazione, dall'occupazione di via del governo vecchio, dal movimento femminista, e il femminismo è stata una rivoluzione che ha cambiato la vita delle donne, ma anche il modo di pensare, no? Delle donne e degli uomini di questo paese, e ha costruito diritti e libertà delle donne, ma anche per tutti. Dicevo, questo è il luogo anche del pensiero, e c'è stata una rivoluzione anche culturale da parte del movimento femminista, a partire dalla critica all'universalismo neutro dei diritti. E quindi noi come donne, come femministe, abbiamo parlato per la prima volta di diritti sessuati. Il diritto del lavoro, il diritto alla salute sono diritti sessuati. Quindi anche i ragionamenti, gli studi, il progetto che state facendo qui oggi è per noi preziosissimo, perché recupera questa cultura critica che, devo dire, è molto sotto attacco, perché in generale io vedo una vera strategia di rimozione della storia del Novecento, di rimozione anche di neutralizzazione della forza politica ma anche culturale del femminismo. Quindi riprendere questi studi, gli studi di genere, sulle differenze di genere, è per noi fondamentale, anche perché le disuguaglianze di genere sono aumentate ed è giusto che dentro alle statistiche che la nostra Premier dice bisogna indagare appunto le differenze di genere e valutare gli effetti delle politiche pubbliche sulle condizioni di vita delle donne. L'ultima cosa che vorrei dire: è molto importante riparlare di questi indici delle disuguaglianze di genere, perché abbiamo fatto la manifestazione straordinaria indetta da non una di meno il 25 di novembre. Le disuguaglianze sono il terreno dove cresce la violenza di genere, quindi è molto importante. Per questo io vi auguro buon lavoro e penso che la Casa sia il posto giusto per discutere insieme oggi. Grazie.
Allora, grazie mille a Maura Cossutta, la Casa Internazionale delle Donne di Roma, che è sempre un punto di riferimento fondamentale per tutte le femministe d'Italia. Ci sono delle storie nuove che si intrecciano e genealogie che è importante sempre tenere collegate al presente e al futuro, è il motivo per cui abbiamo scelto come associazioni che hanno organizzato questo progetto e questa occasione di confronto proprio di essere qua. Questo proposito mi presento, sono Giulia Sudano, sono presente all'associazione Video Think Tank, che è un'associazione che è nata a fine 2020 proprio per promuovere l'equità di genere con un approccio femminista ai dati, quindi ha tratto ispirazione proprio dal lavoro di Lauren Klein e Catherine Ignazio sul femminismo dei dati, del Data Feminism, per lavorare e portare proprio queste pratiche in Italia. E anche conoscendo il lavoro appunto di Sarah Williams Data Action, quindi potete capire insomma la gioia che abbiamo nell'essere qui e siamo anche vicini, facciamo tutto dal compleanno di Period, che è il 10 dicembre, che abbiamo scelto proprio la giornata internazionale dei diritti umani, perché lottare contro le disuguaglianze di genere vuol dire lottare per i diritti umani, come hanno riconosciuto le Nazioni Unite una serie di enti, quindi siamo felici di festeggiare ormai, manca proprio il 10 dicembre, questi 4 anni con le persone che hanno ispirato, le autrici che hanno ispirato il nostro lavoro. Questo è stato possibile però che abbiamo lavorato in rete con associazioni per noi molto importanti che sono The Good Lobby e Prime Minister. Si presenteranno dopo diciamo, le discorsi delle speaker, ci saranno quindi Lauren Klein e Sarah Williams, ci sarà l'occasione di un dibattito, lo apriranno appunto le associazioni che hanno organizzato, si presenteranno anche in quell'occasione. Lavoro importantissimo che fanno sia per il lobby civico del Good Lobby che la formazione di scuole politiche per giovanissime dai 14-19 anni di Prime Minister, quindi siamo davvero felici di questa collaborazione in rete che abbiamo fatto per questo progetto che è Data Feminism in Action, che è stato possibile grazie al finanziamento dell'Ambasciata statunitense in Italia, che ci ha permesso di portare le autrici dagli Stati Uniti in uno scambio appunto culturale, di pratiche, di contenuti qui negli Stati Uniti. E proprio per questo motivo do subito la parola a Karen Schinnerer, addetta culturale dell'Ambasciata statunitense qui a Roma. Grazie mille per il vostro supporto fondamentale per questo progetto, che, dico solo una cosa, è oggi è la terza tappa, i 3 giorni. Abbiamo fatto infatti se ci vedete un po' occhiaie un po' pesanti in giro, è perché, anche perché giustamente ringraziamo molto le autrici che hanno incastrato nei loro calendari molto fitti e che insegnano, mettono moltissimi impegni questi 2 giorni di disponibilità. Quindi abbiamo iniziato a Bologna il 5 dicembre, ieri Sara Williams era a Napoli, oggi abbiamo insieme Lauren Klein e Sara Williams a Roma. Quindi le ringraziamo di aver trovato spazio nuovamente, e quindi ecco, se vedete un po' di occhiaie pesanti per questo motivo, ma siamo appunto per una stanchezza positiva e diciamo di gioia.
Mi sentite? Buongiorno, sono Karen Schinnerer, l'addetta culturale presso all'Ambasciata degli Stati Uniti a Roma. Vorrei ringraziare la Casa internazionale delle Donne per averci ospitato oggi. Sono molto felice di stare qui per il loro continuo impegno a supporto dei diritti delle donne e nella creazione di uno spazio per il dialogo e l'empowerment. Grazie per averci accolto in questo luogo così bello, magnifico e ricco di storia. Vorrei anche ringraziare Valentina Bazzarin e Giulia Sudano per il loro impressionante lavoro nell'organizzare tutti questi eventi. Un sincero ringraziamento va anche a Period Think Tank e The Good Lobby per il loro instancabile impegno nel promuovere l'eguaglianza di genere in Italia e nel favorire importanti discussioni e azioni su questi temi cruciali. Un ringraziamento anche al nostro partner di lunga data, la Prime Minister's School of Politics for Young Women, per il loro impegno nella formare la prossima generazione di leader in Italia, offrendo un'educazione politica essenziale e promuovendo l'impegno civico per affrontare le sfide del nostro tempo. Questo evento evidenzia un progetto che affronta una delle sfide più urgenti dei nostri tempi, la raccolta dei dati, in particolare il concetto stesso di Data Feminism. Ci sfida a ripensare come i dati vengono raccolti, analizzati e utilizzati, assicurandoci che queste pratiche non perpetuano diseguaglianza, ma promuovono giustizia e inclusività. I dati sono uno strumento essenziale per un'efficace advocacy e per l'impegno civico, poiché forniscono le prove necessarie per identificare i problemi, comprenderne le cause profonde e spingere all'azione. Quando partiamo dai dati, diamo potere agli individui e alle comunità da prenderne decisioni informate, costruire argomentazioni solide e rendere le istituzioni responsabili. Fondando l'advocacy sui dati, possiamo promuovere politiche e soluzioni che non solo siano basate su prove concrete, ma che siano anche mirate ed efficaci nell'affrontare le specifiche esigenze di gruppi marginalizzati o meno rappresentati. In questo modo, i dati diventano un potente motore di cambiamento, aiutando le comunità a organizzarsi, mobilizzarsi e infine influenzare le politiche che impattano le loro vite. Spero che questo programma offra l'opportunità di riflettere su questi importanti temi e ci permetta insieme di fare progressi nelle questioni di genere sia negli Stati Uniti che in Italia. Grazie mille.
Grazie mille a Karen Schillerer e ci tengo a ringraziare anche Raissa Brighi che ci ha seguito diciamo, anche nell'operatività che qua, grazie Raissa per tutto il lavoro insomma, degli ultimi mesi, tutta l'ambasciata per il supporto. Allora, devo introdurre la prossima speaker che è Michela Cicculli, per i saluti iniziali, Presidente della Commissione Pari Opportunità del Comune di Roma. Sono sempre molto felice, innanzitutto perché con Michela condividiamo percorsi di attivismo dal basso da tanto tempo e poi perché diciamo, si collega alle ultime settimane un pezzo importante dell'attività di Period, perché da quando siamo nate, dicevo, no, questa missione del promuovere l'equità di genere e un approccio femminista ai dati. Detta la romana, che vuol dire? Allora, a parte che ne parleranno Lauren specificatamente, rientra dentro la action di parlerà Sara, però l'abbiamo deciso di declinare con una campagna specifica che è Dati per contare. Noi dal 2021 stiamo portando avanti questa campagna che chiede a tutte le istituzioni, a partire dai comuni, di prendersi i due impegni, di aprire e disaggregare i dati di genere e grazie a questi dati poter fare la valutazione di impatto di genere delle politiche pubbliche, quindi dall'inizio della programmazione fino alla sua monitoraggio, esecuzione e monitoraggio finale, quindi che cosa hanno ottenuto le politiche. Quindi per noi è una grande diciamo, rivoluzione culturale no? In Italia, cioè il fatto che chiunque debba prendere le decisioni pensi quello che sto per fare, che impatto può avere in modo diverso sulle singole persone, che non sono tutte uguali e non esiste un neutro. Questa è un po' la grande sfida. Il primo comune ad aderire in Italia è stato il comune di Bologna, ci sono state altre città metropolitane, ma anche poi tanti comuni più piccoli e medi e piccoli, molti in Emilia Romagna, ma non solo, abbiamo anche Piano degli Albanesi, per dire, non in Sicilia, quindi è per tutti i tipi di comuni. E l'ultimo, ma non per ultimo, è il comune di Roma Capitale, che ha aderito a settembre, più o meno. Questo grazie a Michela che ha fatto veramente un lavoro di pressione molto forte, quindi siamo molto contenti di averla insomma, qui oggi, non solo nella sua veste istituzionale, ma anche perché grazie al suo lavoro e all'attività che fa stiamo per capire come possiamo mettere in pratica questo tipo di approccio in una città complessa come Roma. Quindi grazie a Michela per il tuo lavoro, per essere qua e per quello che cercheremo di ottenere anche in una città difficile come Roma.
Grazie a voi, grazie a tutte voi, alla Casa, ovviamente all'Ambasciata per il sostegno a questo progetto. Come diceva Giulia, il percorso che abbiamo cominciato diverso tempo fa ci ha portato a settembre all'approvazione della delibera di adesione del Comune al progetto e a Dati per contare, più che un'adesione, un avvicinamento che è un punto di inizio, perché la delibera pensiamo sia uno strumento per fare un lavoro di stress all'interno dell'amministrazione, di pressione, di anche monitoraggio rispetto a quello che è contenuto nella delibera, e che in qualche modo è una sfida amministrativa gigante e credo una sfida politica ancora più grande, perché dal punto di vista amministrativo abbiamo capito, qua c'è anche insomma lo staff della Commissione Pari Opportunità, abbiamo capito tramite interlocuzioni con i dipartimenti, gli uffici di Roma Capitale, che sui dati c'è diciamo un grandissimo silenzio spesso, nonostante in molti atti, in molti documenti si dice che gli uffici devono avere una consapevolezza rispetto ai numeri, ai dati, ai flussi di dati, purtroppo in realtà gli uffici non sono nelle condizioni, non hanno le competenze, non hanno gli strumenti per portare avanti questo tipo di lavoro, e ovviamente Period lo sottolinea e ha scelto proprio di fare un lavoro specifico su questo, quindi sui dati in ottica di genere dentro le pubbliche amministrazioni. La sfida è molto grande, è, come dicevo, appunto amministrativa, perché stiamo proprio facendo un lavoro di sensibilizzazione anche della dirigenza rispetto all'importanza di formare il personale nella raccolta dei dati e anche poi della lettura dei dati, al momento questo lavoro dovrebbe essere stimolato dall'ufficio statistico dell'ente locale, che però non è nelle condizioni di farlo ad oggi. Quindi questo significa consapevolezza, che significa risorse economiche, ma anche risorse in termini di competenze e di capacità del personale nella raccolta dei dati, e significa ovviamente anche una visione rispetto al futuro e tutte quelle che sono anche le sfide ad esempio dell'intelligenza artificiale, che in comune con circa, diciamo, sulla carta 4 milioni di abitanti, ma poi sappiamo con un flusso di cosiddetti city users ancora più grande, non può, come dire, non tenere in considerazione, proprio guardando al futuro. Dicevo anche una sfida politica, perché la consapevolezza dei dati crea potere nelle mani delle persone, crea un vincolo di responsabilità anche dell'amministrazione rispetto a quello che i dati ti restituiscono come domanda, come bisogno, come necessità della città. E io non do per scontato che la parte politica voglia sempre rendere chiare queste evidenze, perché questo significa che poi è necessario, è doveroso, è d'obbligo attivarsi. E questo è un altro tema su cui credo che dobbiamo fare un lavoro di pressione e anche di consapevolezza della cittadinanza rispetto all'importanza di richiedere e anche di collaborare nella creazione di dati, nella condivisione di dati, che spesso invece è qualcosa su cui si è un po' restii a metterci anche il proprio contributo personale. Quindi diciamo l'approvazione della delibera è uno strumento, non era il fine ultimo ovviamente del lavoro che abbiamo fatto, è uno strumento che in qualche modo ci mette nelle condizioni di poter continuare queste interlocuzioni, renderle sempre più forti e sempre più efficaci, fino appunto anche a cambiare proprio la struttura amministrativa, perché se diciamo che ad oggi non siamo in grado di farlo, dobbiamo immaginare come anche trasformare l'ente locale in progetto in questo senso, quindi anche un potere trasformativo del progetto di questa collaborazione, che credo sia anche un po' la sfida poi di come cambiare la democrazia nel vero senso della parola. Grazie.
Grazie mille a Michela Cicculli, questa è la dimostrazione dell'importanza del dentro-fuori, no? Delle alleanze tra femministe su cui si lavora da tanto tempo per cercare di rinforzare la spinta da fuori, da dentro, per trasformare le istituzioni in mondo in un modo insomma, che sia più giusto e migliore per tutte le persone, non solo per le donne o le minoranze di genere. Bene, grazie mille Michela Cicculli, Karen Schimmerer e Maura Cossutta per aver avviato insieme questa mattinata, e invito Sara Williams e anche Lauren, if you want to stay together here one at a time. E, allora, intanto per voi vi dico che il programma cosa vi aspetta? Ci saranno appunto le presentazioni di Sara Williams e Lauren Klein, avranno circa mezz'ora a testa, e poi è tutto dibattito e confronto con loro. Volevamo al massimo ottimizzare e sfruttare la possibilità di confrontarci con loro e dare la possibilità a tutti e tutti di avere uno scambio circolare. Quindi mentre sentite tutti i commenti o domande, segnatele, preparatevi, perché dopo sarà tutto, diciamo, opportunità di confronto con loro. Grazie. C'è la presentazione.
Oh, absolutely, sure. So you can see together. That's fine. Here. Sarah, where do you want to be? Do you want to be next to the slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Actually, that's probably. Thank you. Sit it down, right?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
We open already both, so you already find them open.
Perfect. Okay, great, super.
If it is okay.
Oh, no, we can switch so that
Sure.
you can see the notes
Sure.
also.
Yeah, I think that, okay.
Right?
Right, so I think if we just present off of that laptop, then.
Yeah. And then we can switch.
Okay.
No, okay.
Arriviamo, sta aprendo le slide. Va bene,
Sorry, do you want any water?
Sì, ormai visualizzo oppure vengo spesso we made it.
Yes. Okay, I'll take this off so maybe I sit up here so that I can see my slides. Good morning, everyone. How are you? Fine. We got the technology on this computer, amazing. I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me here. It's really nice to be here in Italy and to meet so many people that are interested in using data for good. So thanks so much for inviting us to participate in this conference. So my name is Sarah Williams, and I run the Civic Data Design Lab at MIT, and also the Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism. The Leventhal Center is an interdisciplinary research center of architects, urban planners, landscape architects, media scientists, computer scientists. And the idea of the center is we can't solve the problems of cities with just one field, and really we have to bring those fields together, and we make long-term relationships with cities. I am myself very interdisciplinary. I'm trained as a geographer, an architect, an urban planner, and a data scientist. And I combine my training in computation and design to create visualizations that create policy change. And I'll show you some of those projects today. One of the things that I think is really important when we're using data and to have an impact in society is to have these kinds of interdisciplinary teams. So often my teams have computer scientists, urban planners, media artists, architects, policies, people from NGOs, and others. And I think it's this group of people that can take data to action, which is the name of my most recent book about how to use data as a tool for empowerment rather than oppression. So I want to talk a little bit about where the idea of the book came from. You know, in the last decade, we've had unprecedented amounts of data. And in the next decade, that amount of data is set to grow tenfold. And whilst some data is open that you can find on open data sites like this one in New York City, most of that data is closed, like the previous slide. And while civic hackers and McKinsey, among others, were using data for all kinds of social good, at the same time, we found that much of this data was creating more inequity. So, and while much of this debate started to come up in academia, I felt like the message wasn't getting across to those people working in the field of urban planning, to the civic technologists, to others, about how data can be used for oppression, but nobody was giving any a pathway to use it for good. And so what we decided to do with data action is to think about how to think about the inequitable ways that we use data, but also give people a pathway to understand how to use that data for a public benefit. So in the book, we created something called the data action principles, and I'll use those principles to guide my conversation today. So the first principle is to do no harm. We must interrogate the reasons that we use data and determine the potential for our work to do more harm than good. So I'm going to start by illustrating an example of what I mean by this. So I do a lot of work in Nairobi, and if you're not familiar with Nairobi, this is a typical scene on the street. What you're seeing here are matatus. They're the main informal transit system in Nairobi. And if you can believe it, there is no data, or when I started working in Nairobi, there was no data on where these buses go. One of the things that I get invited to do is do transportation models in developing countries. And so I thought, how could I create raw data for my model, but open that data up for everyone to use and build upon? So we created an app with the University of Nairobi Computer Science Department to collect data on the routes and stops. And here you can see that data coming in. And you can see that, it's a series of numbers and text strings, and it's hard to make sense of that information. And we wanted it to be accessible to anyone to use. So we decided to create a visualization. Here you're seeing a map similar to what you would see in London, Rome, DC, Paris, right of the subway system. And then we edited that map of the data. Thank you for turning the light off. My slides are very visual. They're better when they're dark, yeah. But when you can see here is by making these transit lines visible, for the first time, you can see the system as one system that can be planned for. And what's happening here is, in fact, the bus drivers are helping me edit the map, but they're also planning routes and stops. They're thinking about, why are there no matatus in this region? What are ways that we can improve upon the system? But I think what's more important here is also NGOs and others that supply funding for this work now saw it as an organized system that they could help and assist, where before they were thinking about it as being one-off drivers. So to go back to my first point about doing no harm, since we've done this work, we've actually helped over 100 cities develop their own maps, and we created a resource center to do this work. But when cities come to us, we first check if exposing this data would do any harm. And so in many cases, these systems, while they provide an essential resource in terms of transportation, by visualizing them, we would create government crackdown, police activity. And so I would say about 5 or 6 different cities, we decided not to make these visualizations because it could potentially remove the system from the roadways and remove an essential resource for the public. So thinking about, obviously we would all want to have a map of our subway system, but we don't want that map if it would cause that system to not exist anymore. So as you can see, building teams is really important to the work that we do around data for action. And in the case of Nairobi, of course, we did that, but also in a recent project in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, we work with the World Food Program, the Migration Policy Institute, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Organization of American States to understand the motivations and costs associated with migrating to South America to the US. So we took data in the regions of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, where people were getting returned to when they were deported from the United States. And we asked, together we created, this video is not showing, weird. Spontaneous. Let's try.
Yes.
All right. We'll go and fast forward. And so together we created a report. I'm not sure why. Something is wrong. Something is wrong with the report.
It has code inside.
Maybe we just skip that slide.
Yes.
I think we just go ahead.
It's great, isn't it?
What?
It's weird, yeah.
It's weird. I don't know. There must be
Let's
a.
skip it.
Let's skip it. I'm gonna go ahead. So together we had created a report, and I had seen reports in my colleague's office, and we thought that message isn't getting across. So for a congressional hearing in 2022 about the issue of migration, we asked if we could make this data visualization. And this data visualization, at that time, congressional hearings were happening on Zoom, so we put this link in the Zoom so that people could interact with the data. And one of the findings from our report said that migrants in 1 year spent $2.2 billion to migrate, and that the US spends the same amount of money, $2.9 billion, to keep those same migrants out. And really, one of the things that the report showed is the mass amount of money that is spent by migrants, mostly going back to the black market, to the narcos and the same reason that they are fleeing the country to begin with. And migrants take on almost all of the risk in terms of debt and risk to their life. And we created this visualization that ultimately recommended to expand legal pathways for Central American migrants migrating to the US. We showed through the data and visualizations that expanding these pathways would benefit the US in terms of a labor force, also benefit the countries in which they came from by providing aid that the migrants sent back home. And that's exactly what the US Congress did. The senators that were at the hearing made a recommendation to the Biden administration citing our findings in their letter. And then just 2 months later, the Biden administration opened up more visas for Central American migrants to come to the US. So this is the way in which we can think about how to use data to advocate for those on the margins of society. We asked the congressmen that were at the hearing, how did they make their decision? And one of the things that they talked about is that they felt, whoa. Wow. This is fun. This is a fun adventure. I'm not sure, maybe my technology is too advanced for this computer. I'm gonna skip that slide. So one of the things that came out of that is now we do a lot of work with the World Food Program around the issue of migration because our work was so successful in advocating for the needs of migrants. We have done a more recent project in West Africa, and I think I might skip talking about this just in the needing some time to catch up from all of the crashes of my computer, or this computer, but this project that looks at West African migration takes one route from West Africa to Libya and tries to illustrate the risks in which migrants face along the route. And so what we do here is illustrate the stories of the migrants on the top, and then on the bottom we have data from 6 different aid agencies that talk about that risk that exists along the route, creating this risk map. And you can interact and play with that data and understand the experience of migrants along that pathway. So one of the things that we talk about is changing power dynamics. So building data helps change the power dynamics inherent in controlling and using data while also having numerous side benefits such as teaching data literacy. So in this project, we have created a map of internet use in Nairobi, and these red pixels show where internet use is very low. So you might have data on your phone, but you don't have good access to data in these areas of the city, which unsurprisingly are very poor areas of Nairobi. And so we thought, how could we create a wireless network for these areas that's community owned and a data collection tool that's community built? And so one of the things in Nairobi is that in the areas that we were working in Kibera, it's very poor area and it's very overstudied, but no resources are provided back to, so a lot of data is extracted from the community, but not given back. So here, these are my colleagues in Nairobi creating this wireless network. And we built this network during COVID, providing an essential resource for them when everything went online. But we also added to these wireless hubs air quality sensors. And here you can see we're literally adding Nairobi to the map. So much data is missing in Africa, particularly around environment. And here we are adding that data. But just to step back, the importance here is that there have been many studies that put air quality sensors in Kibera, and by NGOs and others, and they never give the data back to the community. So in this case, the data is owned by the community and they sell it to the NGOs so that they own and control their data, and then they are making a profit off of selling their data, which allows the wireless network to exist. And so this exchange helps these studies benefit the community rather than the studies are typically extractive of those same communities. So the value here is not just infrastructure development, but social development. So one of the things that we do for data action is expose hidden systems. So coming up with unique ways to acquire, quantify, and model data can expose messages previously hidden from the public eye. However, we must expose those ideas ethically, going back to the first principle of doing no harm. And so in this project, we measured or tried to expose the issue around ghost cities in China. If you guys are not familiar with ghost cities, they are vacant residential developments that exist in existing cities, and it's a type of development that's now been exported all over the world, right? Building very expensive properties that nobody lives in, but it creates a huge amount of risk in the real estate market. So in this project, we were trying to identify where these are to expose the risk and allow people to be aware of it. But now we all know about this. I mean, if you've heard about it in the news, Evergrande, we did this project before that, trying to make people aware of this. And basically what we did is we scraped data from Dianping, which is the Chinese version of Yelp. And we took the premise that thriving communities need amenities. They need places to go to the grocery store, shopping, so forth. And if you don't have amenities, you're probably a ghost city. So when our model is based on this idea of proximity to amenities. So after we scraped the data from Dianping, we measured how close each amenity was to a residential location. And then we applied Hanson's gravitational model for urban accessibility that looks at, it takes into account that if you live in a suburb, you will travel further to go to the grocery store than if you live in the city center. And then we gave each residential location an amenity score, and then we did spatial autocorrelation or clustering around those amenities to identify potential ghost cities. And then we went here we did this in 10 cities in China, but here is Xinyang. And we went and actually ground truth what was on these red locations that we've now identified as ghost cities. So we found things like this. This is a residential development that was developed maybe 5 years ago. And the government would say the economics of building this was more important than whether somebody lives here, that eventually somebody will move to this location. Ground truthing is really important to the work that we do. So here we actually went to ground truth the sites, but we also went and asked people whether or not our data rang true to them, right? Because I think we often do data analysis. So here we made sure that what we were finding was true to our model, but I also asked urban planners in China whether or not our analysis made sense to the work that they're doing. And one of the things that they said is that these vacant developments are very controversial. By having this map, it's helping them communicate to the government, so local officials know that these are bad, but have no voice to talk to the higher levels of government. But I think one of the most interesting things was when we talked to this real estate developer who told us that basically the bank and the government are the same thing. So that if you, the government wants their money back for loans, so all of these vacant developments, the bank/government need their money back. And so the government opens up a new piece of land, gives them a loan for that piece of land. They use that loan to pay back the previous property. And so it's created a Ponzi scheme, which we are now seeing. And that was because of us having a conversation with him that we could understand this process. So sharing data is also essential for communicating the needs for policy change and generating a debate essential for that work. And data visualizations are an effective way to do that. So in this project, we took data from the prison incarceration system, and this is data that maps where people lived before they went to prison. And we translated that data into a map, and we added it up block by block, how much it costs to incarcerate people from that block. And these red blocks, over $1 million is spent to incarcerate people from these blocks. If you take these 17 blocks, you see over $17 million is spent to incarcerate people from these blocks. And these same blocks don't have proper education, proper job training, proper health services, proper childcare. And the point of these maps was saying, if we could just spend $1 million of that dollar on improving the community, we would spend less on criminal justice and incarceration system. And we did these maps for 10 different cities in the US. And then we asked urban planners, policy experts to say, what would we do in this community if we reallocated just $1 million to improve the system? These maps were seen in the Museum of Modern Art, and they're on the walls still today. But what's important about noting this is that because they were on the walls of the museum, a congressman asked us if he could use these maps to advocate for re-entry programs in the US. And so having seen these on the walls, he contacted us. We gave him the maps of the 10 cities, and then he used it to advocate for the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Act of 2010, which allocated $25 million for programming. Of course, that's not enough if we saw that those 17 blocks are 17 million, but at least it was using some data to advocate for policy change. Finally, the seventh principle is creating your own ethical standards, reminding that data are people and we must do them no harm. And we must seek to create and develop our own ethical standards and call on others to do the same. And while Facebook was unable to do that, right, they had their own ethicists who were flagging issues and they were not listening. We need to make sure that we create those ethical standards as technology advances before the ethics. And it's up to us to create the change that we want to see and ultimately take data to action. Thank you.
Yes. Professional.
Okay, fine. Ooh, okay.
Can everyone hear me if I speak like this?
Yeah.
Yeah, good enough? Okay, thank you. Thank you. That was an amazing talk to precede my talk. And I just wanted to also thank Valentina and Julia and the US Embassy. And it's been amazing to learn about the history of this historic space, the Casa della Donna. It's really such an honor to be presenting this work here. And also all of the exciting work that's happening in Rome about the gender-based policy analysis. It seems like a wonderful moment for everyone, and it's so heartening to see everyone assembled here. So a little bit about me. My name is Lauren Klein. I am a professor at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US South. Before that, I worked at Georgia Tech, which is often described as the MIT of the South. And before that, I worked in software development. So like Sarah, I come to these questions about gender and data from a very interdisciplinary perspective. I bring together primarily feminist theory and feminist history with a lot of nerdy data work. I work in particular on cultural, social, and historical data, but the lessons that I've learned from that work apply more broadly. And so that was the technical experience that I brought to bear on Data Feminism, which is the book that you see here. Before I go forward, I just want to acknowledge that this is all co-authored work, and the presentation is one that Catherine and I have worked on together. Catherine DeGazio is an associate professor of urban science and planning in Sarah's department at MIT, and urban planning at MIT. And what we do in our book is also present a set of principles for doing more ethical and empowering data science that are explicitly informed by intersectional feminism. The book, as you can see here, it's available online on the internet, open access for free, in English and Spanish and also Farsi. There is an Italian translation in process, but unfortunately it's not ready yet. But rather than just sort of summarize the book, what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about our motivation for writing the book, and a little bit of sort of discussion of the principles and ideas from feminism that we use to inform the thinking behind the book. And then what I want to do is think about how the conversation has moved forward after the book was published, and more specifically, how the principles of data feminism can be applied or need to be rethought in the context of current conversations around AI. Okay. So to get started, as we were writing the book, we were increasingly aware that data was becoming a tremendous form of power. And I think many of us in the same space were realizing this as well. So I think we were all sort of learning from many of the sources that you see up here on the screen, which were also sources that Sarah had in her presentation, and this is not a coincidence, right? Scholars like Sophia Noble, Virginia Eubanks, Julia Angwin, all of these people were showing us that data could be incredibly powerful, but at that time, and honestly probably still today, the data was being wielded incredibly unequally, and more specifically, it was being wielded by a small and homogenous group of corporations and other very well-resourced institutions, including government institutions, because these were the people who had the resources to design and then deploy these data systems, now increasingly AI systems, and they were designing and deploying them for their own profit. And when their profit was what was motivating the design, it usually came at the expense of literally everyone else. And so this is where feminism enters in, and what we explain in the book is that feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, has been focused on precisely this, on these imbalances of power and the structural forces that cause them. This has been the central project of feminism for a very, very long time. And so, one of the things, if you listen to the conversation right now about AI that people talk about, they talk about the brittleness of these systems, by which they mean the surprise with which people realize that these AI systems that have been optimized for certain groups and not others, when they are deployed in the world, it turns out that they sort of don't work so well for the groups that they were not designed to support. But the basic idea that systems, not just technical systems, but social systems, political systems, are only optimized for one group and not any other, this is not news to feminists, right? Or you can take the basic idea of bias in training data, right? Just the idea that biases are essentially baked into the cultural record. This is the ground truth for so much feminist work, scholarship, activism, etc. So these were some of the things that, in 2018, 2019, when we were writing the book, and then that we're still seeing today, that really made us think that data science could stand to learn so much from, the many, many years of feminist scholarship and activism and political thought that had attuned us to these issues. So before we move forward, I think it's always really important to do some level setting about what it is that I mean when I say feminism, because this is a word that has many different meanings for many different people. And not all of those meanings are even compatible with each other. And so when writing the book, Catherine and I spent a really long time trying to define with precise terms what our feminism was. And it consists of three things. At its core, it consists of a belief in equality for all genders. So this includes women and men, it includes cis and trans people, it includes non-binary folks. But if you take a look around you, you realize that this goal of equality has not yet been realized in the world. And so it was really important for me and Catherine that our feminism also necessarily include this commitment to action. And then feminism has a third definition, which is a set of theories and ideas. And so these theories began by thinking through questions of inequality with respect to sex and gender. But then, like I said, decades and decades of scholarship and just the pervasive and persistent political reality has brought many, many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation, including race and ethnicity, class, sexuality, ability, disability, immigration status, all of these things and more. So this brings me back up to this idea of intersectional feminism. And this is a concept that I think most of you are already familiar with. But it's really important to say, I think, out loud that this comes to us from a specific group of feminists. It comes from women of color feminists and from Black feminists in the United States in particular. And what feminism gains, feminism broadly, gains from this particular framework. So you could think of concepts like the Company River Collective's formulation of what they call interlocking systems of oppression, Kimberly Crenshaw's term, intersectionality, Patricia Hill Collins' idea of the matrix of domination. These are all formal frameworks that help structure critiques of power. So they help us sort of atomize with precision the reasons why certain people might experience privilege on the one hand or oppression on the other. And once you understand how these systems work, you can identify the specific places where you want to intervene. And so that was really important to us in writing the book and remains really important now because it gives the work that we all want to do and the change that we want to make possible, it gives it focus. So what Catherine and I do in the book is we use the teachings of intersectional feminism along with other ideas from feminist activism and feminist critical thought in order to arrive at these 7 principles for doing more ethical and equitable data science. And they are examine power, challenge power, rethink binaries and hierarchies, elevate emotion and embodiment, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. And in the book, how the book is structured is that we have one chapter devoted to each principle where we talk a little bit about the theory that underlies that particular principle, and then illustrate how it can be applied in the data or data science world for just a lot of examples. And so, like I said before, if you're interested in this, you can go read the book, but I'm not going to go through all of them now. But what I do want to say is that our general goal was really to sort of operationalize feminism. So to provide a very clear set of principles for people currently working with data, for people who want to work with data, or for people who want to refuse to work with data, but want sort of an ideological justification for doing so. So it's been so affirming to see how the principles have been taken up, especially in the policy space, and especially for me as someone who largely exists in academia. I mean, my work is deeply nerdy. So this is all great to be in this room. It's very exciting for me. So Data Feminism, as you all know, it came out a while ago. It came out in 2020, and we were writing it even before that in 2018 and 2019. And this was well before this most recent wave of generative AI, and certainly the EU AI Act and all of the conversation that is happening right now about AI, its potential uses and its certain harms, right? And so most recently, Catherine and I have been thinking about our principles with respect to AI because so many of the biases and inequalities that we see these systems reproducing are related to problems with data that we talked about in Data Feminism. And so what I want to do for the second half of my talk is just briefly discuss 2 problems. I guess this is not really the second half, this is like the middle section. Just discuss 2 of these data problems, which are missing data and biased data, and show both sort of why they still matter, and also some things that we can do. So I'll start with missing data. So this is actually an example that comes from Data Feminism, but it remains deeply relevant. It's an artwork. It's called The Library of Missing Datasets. It's by the artist and educator Mimi Onwoha. And she designed, or rather sort of conceived or created this artwork in order to get at the problem of missing data. And she makes her point in 2 ways. So the first is actually as a GitHub repository, which is what you see screenshotted over there. which just lists the data sets that you would expect to exist because they address issues of clear and pressing social need. But in reality, they don't. They don't exist in real life. And then the second way you can encounter this work is through a physical artwork. The artwork is this file cabinet, and the missing data sets that you see listed here are actually the labels on the file folders. And the idea is that you go into the gallery space, you encounter the file cabinet, you tab through the little folders, you see a data set again that you think is interesting or important or you want to learn more about, and you open the folder, but it is empty. So there the data sets are physically missing. But the conceptual point that Onuoha is trying to make is that these data sets are not missing arbitrarily. It's not just that someone forgot to put them in, they're missing for a reason. And the reason is this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world, right? So who has this power? Generally speaking, it's governments, it's corporations, it's well-resourced, I was going to say educational, but also financial institutions. And again, generally minoritized groups, including but not limited to women, generally do not have these resources. And so this is why a feminist approach to data and also AI needs to begin with this analysis of power. Because far too often the data sets that we can access, the models that they're used to train, and in turn the research questions that they can ask, these essentially have already been over-determined by this imbalance of power in the world. And the same thing is true in the policy space, right? If you want to advocate for something, but you don't have the data to provide the evidence to advocate for it, and you just start with looking at the data that you already have, then what you can do is already constrained. And Sarah, you talked about this really beautifully as well, right? Sometimes it's really important to identify the issue first that you care about, and then ask, does the data exist, rather than start just with the data that comes to you. So we already hear a fair amount about missing data and bias data and how these are impacting the output of AI systems in terms of things like gender bias and racial bias, to the point where you sort of roll your eyes when you encounter yet another example of like a text-to-image model that like undresses a woman when asked to touch up a professional portrait. That was like last week's social media news item. Or like if you ask a model, make me an image of a doctor or a scientist, and it produces always an image of a man, right? Like at this point, you sort of know to be very suspicious and skeptical of the biases that are embedded in these large language models that are powering all of the generative AI systems that have been sort of dumped on us in the year 2024. But I wanted to briefly share this example that you might not have thought of, which has to do with bias in art and culture. And so here you see some examples of what happens when you ask one of these text-to-image models to create an image of Islamic art. And because these models have been trained on image archives that come from the world's major art institutions, which were in turn created or selected by the curators who are employed by those museums, who are in turn drawing from the artifacts that are held in those museums' holdings, which in turn got to the museums because of 18th and 19th century European travelers to, in this particular case, Islamic parts of the world. The range of images that these models can create is very, very narrow, right? And this is in spite of the actually very wide variety of examples of Islamic art in the world. So I like this example because it's both one that I certainly didn't think about until I was briefly pulled into this collaboration, but it also shows how not just power broadly, but layers and layers of power compounding over hundreds of years end up shaping these very contemporary models that we encounter, that seem to us very new and state-of-the-art, right? But instead they embed hundreds, if not thousands of years of cultural biases. So what can we do about this? So one example comes to us from feminist data activists in Latin America. And in the book, in Data Feminism, we tell the story of Maria Salguero. She's a Mexican citizen who identified an instance of missing data related to an issue that she cared very much about, which was feminism. Again, feminicide or gender-related killings of women and girls. They include both cis and trans women. They occur everywhere in the world, and they are also legally defined as crimes in many, many countries. But it is almost always the case that the state does not systematically collect data on this issue. And so the laws that are already on the books cannot be enforced because there's no evidence to support the fact that feminicide is a systemic problem in this place. And so Salguero, who lives in Mexico, was very frustrated by this lack of political action. And so she decided to take it upon herself to compile what has now become the largest public data set of feminicide in Mexico. She spends 2 to 4 hours a day logging feminicide on Google Maps. She's been doing this began in 2016, so she's approaching a decade of doing this work. And this data work is really valuable. So she's helped families find out about loved ones who have gone missing. She's provided data to journalists and to NGOs. And ironically, she's been called back in as a private citizen to testify in front of the Mexican Congress about this problem that they identified as a problem, but then failed to totally follow up with any sort of formal action, right? So she is also the expert, again, a private citizen, on this issue of national significance. So in data feminism, we describe this as a form of feminist counter data. So this is activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of certain populations. And it represents one way to use data to challenge power. And actually, one of the interesting things is that we learned in the process of doing research for data feminism that this sort of grassroots and feminist data action and activism around producing counter data is so prevalent in Latin America that it took Catherine in a wholly new research direction, and she actually recently just published a book about feminicide data activism in Latin America, which is amazing and is also open access, and you should all read them. And I'll actually have one more example from this later in the talk. But I want to talk about a question right now, which always comes up when talking about counter data, which is this question, that's great, but you just showed an example of one lady with her Google map counting some numbers. Like, how does this scale? Especially when AI models, as we know, require giant data sets in order to produce any sort of anything that they do. And the short answer to this is yes, it can scale. So over the past year, one of the examples that I find more heartening than others is this area of so-called low resource languages. So these are languages that are pretty much anything that is not English, but low resource languages in particular describe the phenomenon by which languages are spoken by proportionally few people in the world, or in places of the world that have less financial resources devoted to preserving them. And so there's not really enough data or information or knowledge in order to take information about these languages back to these larger AI models. And we've seen a number of efforts, really only accelerating, I would say, in the past year, to create new data sets of these languages for training models that could potentially be used to the benefit of the people who speak these languages. So for example, the Maori language, Te Reo. There's also been work in the development of actual methods for analyzing a range of African languages. But I want to make clear one thing, which is that collecting more data is not the universal solution to issues of missing data and biased data, right? So collecting data on vulnerable populations can very often lead to unwanted exposure or outright harm. And in far too many of these cases, efforts to bring these sort of low resource languages into AI models only end up reinforcing existing power differentials. And so it's very significant that each of the projects that you see screenshotted here are led by people from those communities. And so it's people from these communities who are speaking these languages who are saying, these are the issues that we think our AI models could address if they existed. It is not an outside-in approach. And so this point brings me to a broader principle that can help guide all of us in this work, and it's a feminist principle, and it derives from the work of Sandra Harding and Don Haraway, and a lot of sort of early feminist theorists, and it has to do with the idea of embracing pluralism. And this essentially means listening and learning to a range of sources of knowledge. And it's really exciting that we've started to see some of these participatory processes show up in data science and in data-driven research. And one of Catherine's recent projects relating to the Feminicide book has tried to mobilize this principle in the development of AI systems, and I'm going to talk about this very, very briefly now. So this is the Data Against Feminicide project, and what it sought to do is build AI systems and other digital tools to support data activists like Maria Sabato, who I was talking about just before. And there are a lot of parts of the project. It has a very involved website with a lot of interesting things, but I do want to talk about the participatory part of the development process. So Catherine and her team really prioritized listening to the data activists themselves and learning from them about what they might need before building anything at all. Because in fact, building a tool was not a foregone conclusion. And what Catherine and her group did was hold brainstorming sessions with the activist group to discuss first whether digital tools would be helpful, and if so, how. Some ideas they thought about were whether the tools could help streamline the work or reduce some of the emotional toll of working with data that documents, what is really a series of traumatic incidents, or whether the introduction of these AI tools would just mean, taking away one part of the job, but giving another job instead, which is so often what happens with these promises of technological fixes, right? But one of the really nice things about this is because of this iterative process, Catherine and her team ended up building tools that people actually use. And so the tools that she built are now being used by over 40 human rights monitoring groups. I think the project continues to expand. So again, you should go look at Catherine's website and learn more about that there. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting when talking to Catherine about her work was how insistent, nearly across the board, the activists were that they did not want to fully automate their work. And this is because the activists consider their work to be care work. They saw the time that they spend processing the data, reconciling records, filling in missing information, and so on, as a way of stewarding the memories of these murdered women. And because part of the project overall is refusing to let these women be forgotten, either by the state or in the collective memory, the activists did not want to sort of delegate that work to AI. And it's this idea that there's real value in care work and in the emotional labor associated with what other people might just view as data cleaning. This brings me back to another principle of data feminism, which has to do with the importance of elevating emotion more broadly and pushing back against this false binary that insists that we value reason over emotion, or big over small, or data over experience, right? Rather than valuing both of them at the same time. So I'm going to skip over the theoretical explanation for this, so you can read more about that in the book. But what I'll say now in the context of AI is that a sort of a feminist critique of these false binaries, I think it also helps us sort of cut through what in the US or in English is called like AI hype. And I think in particular, this sort of belief that is being pushed at us, this idea that AI is only a technical system and not both a technical and a social system. But the thing is, big tech wants us to believe that we are interfacing with a purely technical system, because if we admit that these systems are social as well, that is, they are made by people, they are deployed in a world with people, with effects experienced by people, then we can see how the biases and other harms introduced by these systems are not only technical, but are social as well. Which means that they can't be fixed by technical solutions, right? They require social solutions, like dismantling structural sexism and racism, right? But these are not problems, we know how to solve these problems, we know the steps we need to take, but these are not problems that tech companies want to take on, right? So it's convenient for them to insist that what they are doing is only computational. So this is really getting me to the end of my talk, and I realized I didn't start my timer. I feel like I'm going on for a long time, but I'm almost done. The sociologist Ruha Benjamin has been writing recently about default settings, and by this she means sort of the options and outcomes of technology if the status quo is just left unchecked. So with respect to AI, we can see already how the default settings of these AI systems will just result in an acceleration and exacerbation of sexism, of racism, of colonialism, and more, right? The default settings of these AI systems, all they will do is further concentrate power in the hands of the already powerful and continue to whittle away the power of everyone else. But the thing is, as AI researchers or anyone in academia or in the policy space or in this room, these are just the default. We do not need to accept them. They can be changed. So this brings me to the final point that I want to make, which I hope is by now pretty obvious, but it's that AI needs feminism and even more, right? So when you look back to what Catherine and I wrote about data feminism, this centrality of power, this was really depressingly prescient. We're right now experiencing nothing less than the complete capture of AI by these same large corporations who control data collection, in which, of course, this was predicted by, again, decades and decades of academic critiques of capitalism, of colonialism, and I think we really need to return to those for strategies of resistance, as well as insight, again, about how these processes work. But the recent explosion of AI research and AI systems have also brought additional considerations to the forefront. So for one, there are the environmental costs of training these systems, which take these already limited natural resources like water and energy away from people and communities and towards cooling data centers and GPUs. And there are already some really great people working in this space, but we need more climate scientists and environmental studies people working to address this. And then there are the human costs. So we've known for several years about the role that Amazon has played in cloud storage, for example, in the United States with questions of migration and government, the sort of government agencies that deport migrants coming to this country. This was Project Maven, which you may have seen some coverage about here. I don't know. It led to an internal protest by Google, by workers in Google to resist against this. There have also been technology developed by Google to make drone strikes more accurate. And now, to be honest, we're seeing this exact same object detection technology being put to use right now, both in Ukraine and also in Gaza, in what have been called the first AI wars. And I think it's really worth pausing just to consider how, so often we are presented with these tools with the ultimate use case as being benefiting humanity. But far too often, what these tools end up doing is being put in the service of the literal destruction of humanity instead. But I did just want to end on a note of hope, which is that I'm really trying, which is these AI systems, yes, they're incredibly powerful, but they're only as powerful as the data on which they are trained, right? The conditions under which they are developed, and the context in which they are put to use. And if we are going to imagine alternative conditions for their development,
Don't worry, it's not.
okay.
They're not attacking us.
No, that's
Oh, okay. They're stopping me. I was going to say. But so anyway, in any case, but if we're going to imagine alternatives to these status quo, to these default settings, so the way in which these systems are being given to us, so these would be contexts that empower, right, not disempower, then feminism has a very, very clear role to play, right? And it's an interventionist role, it's a political role, because it's a role that needs to challenge these default settings, right? But it does so with a goal that I hope that you all share, which is designing technologies that work towards liberation and not just resource extraction. So that's really all I have for my formal remarks today. And I'm really excited to be in dialogue with Sarah and with all of you in this room about what you're hoping to do here in this city. Thank you so much.
Ok, allora come anticipato prima, adesso cominciamo la fase del dibattito, faremo una domanda per ciascuna ogni organizzatrice, quindi saremo in 3 e poi è aperta a voi, qualsiasi domanda, commento, vi invitiamo caldamente ad approfittarne. Allora, comincerà Ardalello per period, in tempo, e poi chiamiamo le altre. We will ask you to answer after the 3 questions, so you can answer
Oppure una per
one each.
Sì.
Sì? Okay, one each.
Okay, first of all, thank you to the speakers. It was an amazing experience listening to the research that we have been reading for, I mean, all of... Oh, ok, sì, scusate, ok. Dunque, la mia domanda riguarda il rapporto tra pubblico e privato sul tema dei dati, perché diciamo, come tantissime persone abbiamo moltissime app sui nostri telefoni e le nostre diciamo, esigenze vengono trasformate poi in dei dati che le aziende private raccolgono. Questi elementi riguardano ovviamente tantissime abitudini, per esempio Nike sullo sport, elementi riguardanti il nostro ciclo in quanto donne su varie app, Woman Log per esempio, o il tema degli spostamenti anche, quindi per esempio nel libro della professoressa Williams, Data Action, c'è un esempio pratico rispetto al caso di Uber in Uganda. E quindi diciamo il mio interesse era cercare di capire da entrambe le speaker cosa possiamo fare come utenti, come società civile, come attivisti, come ricercatrici affinché diciamo questo gap venga colmato in qualche modo e cercare di fare advocacy eventualmente. Quali sono le strade che avete percorso nella vostra esperienza? Grazie.
Is it 3?
No, we do each one because maybe it's bigger questions, so maybe it's better to answer after.
Do you want to go first?
Sì, no.
Oh, it's okay. Sure, I'll go. I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think what your question is how do we? Oh. That was very hard. I think that your question was about how do we understand all this private data collection, and what are some of the ways in which we can advocate for ourselves within that. And I mean, I think, one of the things that's, really important and I think it goes to my last point in creating our own ethical standards is that, the European government has started to create ways for us to own that data and to create laws about using this private ownership of data, but new types of data and forms of data will be coming out, and it is up to us to fight for our rights and how our data gets used. And so I'm just going to flip this question a little bit and saying, what are the rights of our data being used in large language models? And who owns those models, I think is something that we really need to think about, right? So in fact, all of our data are in those large language models, and we should be advocating for co-ownership of these models. And I think that if these new systems are driven on us, because in a sense, data are people, we should have a say in how and when they can be used. And so what I'm saying is that we own this private data. It is co-built by us, and we need to advocate for that co-building, or the fact that we co-built it, by saying that we actually own AI models and advocate for that.
That was amazing. I think I'm going to say one smaller individual thing and then one more conceptual thing in addition to just saying +1. So I think one thing that is interesting is that in certain spaces we have seen attempts at introducing aspects of privacy protection to our technology. Most recently, and I guess this comes from sort of the first attempt by the EU to regulate technology more generally, in particular privacy on the internet, and like, for example, with cookie policies and things like this. And so even though those are very annoying, I think it's very important to not just say click accept, even though it seems very performative, but to actually show the companies that there are some people who don't want to accept all the trackers and everything. And first of all, just to create data that shows that some of the policies that have been implemented are worth implementing. So that's number one. It's just, but number two is more connected to, I think, what the role of feminism is that can play, which is that, consent is another idea that feminists have spent a really long time thinking about. And I think that some of this deep and broad thinking can become more widely applicable if we are able to bring some of this thinking to conversations about sort of privacy and consent and opting in more generally. And I'm thinking in particular, in the United States, we have something called the fries model, like French fries. But it's theorized consent as freely given, informed, reversible, enthusiastic. Oh my gosh, what's the S? I'm forgetting what the S is. Anyway, secure, exactly, right. Secure. But again, this is something that comes out of feminist experiences in the world, right? That led to a really robust model of how privacy and consent should be understood. And it's really interesting to think about how you might go ahead and apply this or offer this up as a model of consent with respect to these AI systems. And actually, this is something, there's an organization called the Consentful Tech Group that is trying to do just this. And so this is just an example of, again, trying to think about like what it is that we want, and starting from what we know and have learned that it comes to us from feminist ways of thinking and experience, and trying to communicate this sort of more broadly, either through policy or through implementation.
Thank you.
Bene, grazie. Allora intanto inviterei Martina Turola di The Good Lobby.
Buongiorno a tutte, intanto volevo dire che sono molto contenta di essere qui oggi, lo vedo un po' come un coronamento simbolico di un percorso che abbiamo cominciato con Period e con Prime Minister, quando ci siamo conosciute poi di persona durante un tech camp dell'Ambasciata, e a distanza insomma di un po' di tempo posso dire che abbiamo cominciato a collaborare su una serie di progetti molto importanti, tra cui questo, e in particolare avrei molte domande, però in qualche modo cercherò di limitarmi a quelle più importanti, anche relativamente al tipo di lavoro che facciamo insieme, no? Con The Good Lobby e con Prime Minister. La mia organizzazione viene dal mondo del rule of law, dello Stato di diritto, ci occupiamo in qualche modo di cercare di fare sì che vengano rispettate, vengano comunque garantite regole uguali per tutti. E nel corso del tempo è diventato sempre più evidente che queste regole dovevano comunque applicarsi anche a dei sistemi, no? Dei sistemi tecnologici, e le decisioni anche che vengono prese rispetto alle nostre vite diventano sempre più automatizzate. Nel frattempo, no, il discorso intorno all'intelligenza artificiale è diventato sempre più prominente, sempre più importante, fino a quando poi l'Unione Europea, è stato citato prima, ha sentito l'esigenza di approvare, no, un regolamento sull'intelligenza artificiale, che adesso ci trova in una fase particolarmente delicata perché dobbiamo capire effettivamente come implementarlo, e in Italia stiamo lavorando con una rete di associazioni, fra cui Period, Amnesty e altre più attive, no, nel campo della rete dei diritti digitali, per cercare di fare sì che questi sistemi appunto poi non arrivino a penalizzare, no, le comunità marginalizzate, e possono in realtà invece essere utilizzati per avere un impatto sociale positivo. E sono molto contenta di aver visto degli esempi, di poter leggere gli esempi di come effettivamente questo può succedere, perché uno dei problemi che c'è più spesso quando si ha a che fare con la tecnologia è che sì, le organizzazioni tendono a dire quello che non vogliono che succeda con la tecnologia, ma non riescono bene a disegnare il futuro, quello che vorrebbero fare con la tecnologia. E questo è molto importante quando si cercano di coinvolgere anche le persone, quando si cercano di coinvolgere i cittadini e le cittadine nel percorso, no? Nell'attività di mobilitazione. E questa è una difficoltà appunto che stiamo cercando di superare. Quindi questa, diciamo, intanto è una considerazione. La domanda invece che volevo rivolgere ai due speaker è quanto pensano che sia importante anche una forma di alfabetizzazione tecnologica sempre più allargata rispetto a concetti proprio chiave su che cos'è, rispetto a che cos'è un algoritmo, come funziona. Perché quello che mi sembra, cercando di fare appunto sensibilizzazione, di coinvolgere le persone anche in questi percorsi, in questa possibilità appunto di creare coalizioni e reti per far rispettare i propri diritti e fare in modo che la tecnologia non li calpesti, è che ci si scontra a volte anche con una forma un po' di reverenza, no? C'è una difficoltà magari anche a impegnarsi proprio perché si sente che mancano un po' delle competenze di base, quindi per riassumere, per farla anche un po' più facile, è se nella loro esperienza e nei workshop, nei progetti che comunque avete portato avanti, avete anche fatto delle formazioni, una sorta di alfabetizzazione su cosa è l'intelligenza artificiale, come funziona e quanto pensate che questo possa essere importante per il lavoro che faremo.
I think training on artificial intelligence is absolutely essential. We actually just did an exhibit. When you hear yourself talking back to you, it's so funny. But first of all, I think, you know, with artificial intelligence, but also in data in general, literacy is extremely important. And literacy, both data literacy or literacy around artificial intelligence, are important because we also, as a society, need to be able to critique the information and results that are presented to us and not take things as status quo. So the ability to look at a chart and know that that chart is maybe based off false data, or maybe that chart is inaccurately representing information or creating bias in the way that it was developed. But we can't make those assessments unless we have some kind of general literacy. And so I think data literacy in schools are really important. And it's I didn't mention a project here, but it's something that I've been working a lot in K through 12 education, creating different data literacy structures. But I also teach it in my classes at MIT. Even though our students are obviously very data literate, they don't often critique the data that's given to them. And so I think part of the importance of data literacy is the ability to critique. I think with AI systems, more specifically related to that question, there's a real huge misunderstanding in how they are built and formed. And they are not actual intelligence. They are statistical representations of the world. How often is this word next to each other? How often is this color next to this color? And those statistical representations represent what's dominant in culture. And what is dominant in culture, as we know, represents power, and therefore it's recreating, as Lauren mentioned, power structures. And unless we understand that it represents this kind of statistical understanding of what we already record, there is no way that we can, again, be critical or critique what comes back to us from AI systems. And so one of the things that we just did in my lab is create an exhibition that tries to teach people what AI systems do. Is you actually walk into a black box and it decodes and encodes your data. But I think the more that we can try to create, in this case we created an art piece, but the more that we can try to create representations or literacy around AI, the more ability we were able to have the general public to critique the results coming back from it.
I totally want to see that artwork. That sounds amazing.
I was going to show it today, but I was thinking it was too long. Maybe another time I will come back and show you. Oh yes, because we will be in the Venice biannual exhibition in May. So in fact, you guys can come to Venice in May and see this exhibition.
That sounds so amazing. So once again, I'll just try to sort of put some of this in a feminist framework. So I think there's sort of two ways in which feminism is helpful here. Well, two that I can think of off the top of my head. And the first is that it's not a binary of like understanding AI or not understanding AI. It's really important to recognize that you can always learn a little bit more. And just because you can't, understand the same thing as the person who invented the attention algorithm or whatever, it doesn't mean that you can't learn enough in order to understand why certain decisions are being made or how these models are making their predictions or what the training data is that is going into them. And so I think really sort of authorizing yourself and authorizing the students and the community members who we interface with that, you can begin to understand and continue to learn. That's really, really important. So that's one thing. And then the second thing that I'll say, and I feel like this, I would kind of want this to make you angry, the tech companies, it's beneficial to them and it's protective for them to maintain this illusion that AI systems are so complicated that they can't possibly be understood, right? Because this protects them from regulation. Like we saw this in the US Supreme Court when Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who's otherwise like a brilliant woman, but said something to the effect of like, oh my gosh, I can't possibly know enough about how the internet works in order to be able to issue informed decision on this. And it's like, well, why not? It's just a thing that you need to learn about with research and help and anything else. And the tech companies really go a long way to make us think that these systems are so magical because it protects them from any critique. And we've seen this also happen historically in the way in which expertise, and especially learned expertise, gets sort of professionalized and attached to credentials and becomes more associated with masculinized fields. Like this has happened since the dawn of time, right? And the classic examples are like when midwives began to be replaced by doctors, taking experience that women learned in the world about delivering babies, and then it became sort of taken away and attached to medical schools and medical training, and then you couldn't possibly know how to deliver a baby unless you had gone to medical school, right? And this is a shift from women mostly performing this work to men. The same thing is true in kitchens, right? Like, why are there more women cooks but men chefs? It's all this sort of gendered, intentional gendered realignment of purported expertise that you could only learn in certain contexts. This is protective, and it's a real problem because what it does is it prevents everyone else, again, including but not limiting to women, from feeling like they can engage in these issues, which in fact can be pretty well understood just by the experience of living in the world and learning from other people outside of formal educational networks. So that's actually like one of my axes to grind. It's like a thing that I really care passionately about because I see it happening in ways that it's been happening over centuries. So we should stop it.
I want to add just one thing, if I may, if I can. One thing that's interesting, I mean, how many times have you heard somebody say, we don't actually know how AI systems work? Like, have you ever heard that?
We know how they work.
Has anybody? Yes. And when, because I'm also on the board of the computer science department at MIT, and so I review a lot of the case studies of the algorithms that are created. And one thing that I think is really interesting that people don't realize is the reason that AI just blossomed recently, like for years, it was only really 70% accurate, like they couldn't really get the algorithms to work, is because what they decided, one simple thing, is they fed the results from that 70% back into the data set. So basically you're feeding synthetic data into AI systems, which is what actually improves the results of them. And what that means is that actually, like, our AI systems are even more based on fake data than actual real data. And so they're, I mean, it helps to get the accuracy higher, but it's built on feeding results back into the model. So it's kind of an infinite loop of self-referential information. Yeah. Anyways, I always like to explain that because people don't understand that so much of the power of these systems is built on synthetic or fake data.
Grazie mille, intanto. E invito Ludovica Versano di Prime Minister e poi apriamo chiunque di voi ha domande, commenti, molto volentieri. Grazie.
Buongiorno, grazie a tutte e tutti per averci qui. Thank you so much for having us here. It was a pleasure to listen to you. Allora, io sono Ludovica di Prime Minister. Per dare un po' di contesto, Prime Minister è una scuola di politiche per giovani donne, il che significa che è una scuola che propone un percorso per delle ragazze dai 14 ai 19 anni per dargli degli strumenti appunto di formazione in un periodo di empowerment femminile che porti le ragazze ad assumere più consapevolezza non solo delle proprie capacità di leadership, ma soprattutto di come possano operarsi attivamente nel mondo politico e nella loro cittadinanza. Uno degli strumenti che ovviamente ci ritroviamo ad utilizzare sempre di più nelle nostre lezioni è quello dei dati. Sono una delle prime metodologie con le quali possiamo analizzare la realtà e soprattutto in questo periodo storico in cui stiamo vivendo in Italia ritengo che comunque sia obiettivo il fatto che i politici ormai si esprimano prevalentemente tramite l'utilizzo di dati, statistiche e percentuali. Veniamo completamente bombardati da dati decontestualizzati e deresponsabilizzati, quasi vestiti di nuove vesti, ecco, che li rendono anche abbastanza incomprensibili. Di conseguenza la mia domanda è: come potremmo portare le nostre alunne, ma anche in generale le giovani e i giovani a informarsi e successivamente formare anche gli altri sull'interpretazione di questi dati e soprattutto come difendersi da queste percentuali, dati così tanto decontestualizzati dal renderli quasi irriconoscibili, ecco. Grazie.
Yeah, it's such a good question. You know, in Data Feminism, we talk a lot about the importance on insisting that context be incorporated back into data science work, and this is true also in data communication, right? So really trying to model practices that when you present numbers, you also present framing for the numbers and how they were collected and what the findings were, as well as ideally also experiences that affirm or in many cases sort of motivated the initial collection of the data itself. Because it is true that data can never be understood outside of context, and we really need to remind ourselves that even though a number might seem true or seem authoritative, it always came from somewhere. And so in terms of, you know, protecting girls and educating girls so that they don't end up either in the trap of believing numbers that they see or feeling like they are represented by numbers alone or learning to push back against this sort of datafication, I think it does come back to these questions of data literacy. And also for me, again, this insistence that, you know, we and they can learn this. It is not too hard. It is not too complicated. It is a form of knowledge like any other form of knowledge, and there are ways to learn more and educate ourselves, and to do so while modeling the practices that we want to see more prevalent in the world, rather than just replicating the harmful practices that are being shown to us.
Yeah, I am Joshua. But also, I think one thing that's really important is having more women models. As we know, this already is a model of feminism, but I can say that, you know, having myself at MIT before I came to the Department of Urban Studies and Planning program, sorry, tongue twister there. Mostly, people thought data analysis was more male-oriented. More of the people doing data science for urban planning were male. because there wasn't a woman model for how that data science could be deployed. And I saw just the shift in my presence in the university, creating so many women who are interested in now using data to tell their stories, but also getting involved in the field, getting involved with computer science, seeing a model in front of them that they can do this is really important. And so the more that we can bring women into the field so that we have women models for using data science is, I think, really important. We talk about it in coding and other fields, but I think it's very important.
Bene, allora grazie mille. Ora apriamo, non, ovviamente vi obblighiamo a venire qua a fare la domanda come hanno fatto le altre, chi ha voglia di farlo lo può fare dal posto, se ha voglia invece di venire qua può venire qua, però con grande serenità. Allora, ci sono domande, commenti? È il vostro momento, approfittatene. Se hai voglia, se no dal posto come preferite. Ok, bravissimo.
Così ti riescono a sentire chi ci segue.
Se non la ripetete, no?
Eccomi. Allora, vabbè, loro
Se
mi
ti vuoi far
vedono.
vedere, se no puoi anche non farlo.
Bassi.
Oh,
Ciao a chi ci vede
ok,
online.
perfetto.
Allora, io mi presento, mi chiamo Valeria, mi occupo di Femtech. In Italia ho appena fondato un'associazione che si occupa di questo, perché insomma il mondo del Femtech sta crescendo molto anche qui in Italia. Io sono emozionata perché insomma 2 lavori in particolare hanno, diciamo, contraddistinto poi il mio attivismo, e uno è appunto Data Feminism e l'altro è Invisible Women di Caroline Criado Perez, per cui per me oggi essere qui è un po' come assistere al concerto di Madonna dal backstage, cioè per me è proprio una roba bellissimo. Ho una domanda proprio sul proprio tipo gruppi. Ho una domanda proprio sul Femtech, che inevitabilmente affonda proprio le sue radici nel data feminism. C'è molto, insomma, si parlano molto i due mondi, e anche a livello internazionale presenta già delle criticità proprio nella gestione delle dinamiche di potere, perché stiamo iniziando a raccogliere dati sulle donne, ma corriamo il grande rischio che questi dati vengano usati contro di noi. E c'è molto da fare in termini di protezione, c'è molto da fare secondo me anche in termini un po' di regolamentazione del mondo del Femtech, anche da un punto di vista etico, proprio per far sì che chi operi in questo settore segua comunque dei principi che poi sono i principi del data feminism. Quindi volevo appunto chiedervi come vedete lo sviluppo di questo settore in futuro e cosa possiamo fare per evitare, cioè per tenere il potere, insomma, in modo etico su questo settore e aiutare poi veramente le donne per quanto riguarda i temi legati alla salute. Grazie mille.
Yeah, I thank you. I'm glad to know about your organization, and I think the work that you're doing sounds so important. And I think those are very much the questions. You know, in Data Feminism, we talk about something called the paradox of exposure, which is this sort of irreconcilable fact that very often the people who stand most to gain from data being collected about them because they have been underserved by dominant institutions are the exact same people with the exact same data whose lives then become under threat if that data goes into the wrong hands, right? And it's the very same data sets, it's just who is using that data and for whose ends. And we interestingly, didn't talk as much about this in Data Feminism, but I've been thinking a lot about how we can learn from the practices of indigenous data sovereignty that are coming up primarily from Canada and New Zealand, from indigenous groups that really take seriously the idea that the data needs to physically remain housed with the people who it belongs to, whose knowledge it represents, and every step of the way they need to be the ones making decisions about how their data is used, for whose purposes, and very crucially in the world of indigenous data sovereignty, also jet lag. Hi. With the
I couldn't even say my department's name.
I'm not even trying to speak Italian, right? But with the participation of the people whose data it is, right? And so there's the FAIR principles and the CARE principles, and I think these are actually really helpful in thinking more broadly about the importance of data stewardship, because this is a form of knowledge, and the idea that we need to care for this data or steward this data rather than just put it in the cloud, right, is so super important always, but especially as, at least in the United States, we are now facing a resurgence of threats to control and sovereignty over women's bodies by corporations who now offer their free services, but secretly are taking everything we type into them and using them, as Sarah said, to continue to train these models, right? This is happening, the capture of our data is happening everywhere for very nefarious ends. So I think we need to be really intentional about this, and we can learn from some practices that exist already in some other contexts.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said in my talk, we have to change the power dynamics. I mean, the same data can be used for good and bad, and we have to change the power dynamics in which that data is deployed and used. I might take one of Lauren's points, though, a little bit further, and think about when we're thinking about AI systems, one of the things that they are very good at is if you have a smaller model and you collect a lot of data, let's say like you guys are collecting it for, if I'm a tech person or healthcare purposes, you can create these smaller language models that really help your community answer important questions because they're trained on your own data and your own model, and they can be divorced of these larger corporate systems. And I've been really interested in this idea of, if you build your own small language model that's really specialized in your data, like maybe an example is indigenous data languages, right? If you train and make a small model that is really good at translating indigenous text, how can we can now make ownership of that because we built it as a community. And we don't have to let the larger language models access our data. And in that control, we can determine who has access to that information, how much they will charge for it, or when and where we will give people access to that. And I've been getting really interested in this idea that in many ways, all of our specialized communities can create these smaller language models and only allow access to them by people that we give permission to, if that makes sense. And so if we could build a network of small language models that counters these, if we build a network of small language models that are community owned and community built, we can take back control of this larger language model space, if that makes any sense. But I think my point is that we can have control if we create the systems to create that control. And I think that's one of the things as feminist technology people we should be thinking about. So how do we change the dynamic by taking back control of our information? So in this case, by making control of a small language model and determining who and when they can access that, we are taking back control of our information, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Grazie mille. Altri? La fai da lì? Vieni. L'abbiamo pezzito perché la conosciamo, se no non l'avremmo fatto mentre arriva. Se qualcun altro vuole fare o non vuole venire, può rimanere al suo posto. Per te no.
Ok, io. Vabbè,
Ti vuoi far vedere?
Uguale.
Come può? Sì. Ok, vai.
Ok. Prima di tutto, anche per me, io sono Giuditta Bellosi, faccio parte di Period, faccio analisi dati nella vita per un'azienda in realtà, e per me essere qui, ecco, è un grande onore in quanto sono approdata in Period tramite il libro Data Feminism. E la mia domanda è forse un filo tecnica, però fa riferimento proprio poi alla gestione e alla manipolazione dei dati, nel senso che nell'attivismo e in generale in associazioni dove non c'è un portafoglio o comunque un certo potere economico, l'utilizzo di tool che poi vanno a gestire correttamente grandi mole di dati è molto complicato. Noi stessi come Period abbiamo sviluppato una versione di un'app di monitoraggio in primo luogo completamente custom, che però poi ha dimostrato, nonostante la mole del dato non fosse eccessiva, grandi problemi di performance. Quindi la domanda che volevo porvi è se aveste consigli in qualche modo di tool abbastanza open source e a un livello di costi di licenza non particolarmente alti, se non gratuiti, per l'applicabilità poi effettivamente di questi principi con i dati reali da parte di associazioni che non fanno parte né delle università né dei privati. Grazie.
Faccio la battuta, se le vostre università vogliono finanziare.
Esatto.
Okay, this is such an important question, right? Because, you know, we might have open data to use, but we can't actually use it because we don't have the systems to process it. And so, therefore, that data is not actually open to you because you're restricted. So I just want to take a moment to note that problem that you're having. But I think that there are some software that I can recommend, but I would need to know a little bit more about your problem. Maybe we can talk about it offline, but there are now a lot of open source tools for big data processing that can be deployed for. Well, I have to understand more about your problem. Sometimes they're a little bit buggy, but because they're open source, we can co-build them together. Without getting into, like, let's say the nitty-gritty, because the solution is really dependent on what you need. I think this is really important that we create more open source tools that allow us to really open up data for public benefit. But with that, open source tools being opened up for public benefit, we also have to remember that those same tools can be used for bad advocacy as well as good advocacy. But there are a number of open source large language models that can allow you to process data.
Yeah, maybe I'll say sort of two things coming from the sort of funny position that I have. So I have an appointment in a data science department where most people are political scientists, and so they do a lot of causal inference. And so I've been thinking a lot about statistical power and what this tells us and what it doesn't. And I think one thing that I've been realizing is that oftentimes, as you describe, when you're dealing with small data sets that have been hand curated or selected because they really do represent the precise thing that you care about, you can't really do that kind of large scale prediction kind of thing because the data doesn't support it. So in those cases, I think what's really valuable is just to describe the data that you do have, rather than trying to force the data into a mode of sort of results or evidence that is not really aligned with the size of the data set. And there's real value in just sort of saying, we only really could find, 600 instances of this particular thing. Or it turns out that only 2,000 people in the entire population mention this keyword or something like that. There is value just to documenting sort of the fact of the smallness and what it contains. So that's one thing. And then the second thing that I'll say comes from the field that a lot of my data science work takes place in, which is digital humanities. And so there we're also having to use sort of off-the-shelf and open source tools and modeling approaches that come from software libraries, rather on mostly cultural heritage data, which is also very small. And oftentimes what you see applied really generatively is not using the tools to do what they were designed for, but to actually use the tools to show where they don't work. So for example, in the case of like classification, we were trying to decide like, is this thing this category or that category? Those things very, very rarely work with messy data or with old data or with small data sets, because as you described, there's not enough training data, right? But you can say, well, like, what are the examples from the data set that cause this sort of normative dominant classifier to give the worst results? Because again, those errors, and especially the most significant errors, usually take you to outliers in the data set, which in turn represent the experiences that you actually want to amplify. And so sort of flipping it around and saying like, how do these tools break down, for whom or for what data do these tools break down? And let me actually look at those use cases and use those as a sort of pointer towards the data that we actually want to pay attention to, can be a very generative and valuable process. I can point you to papers if you want to see some examples.
Thank you. Grazie. Altri? Ti va di venire, Donato? Vieni pure. Ti quadro, va bene? Sì.
Grazie mille, è stato molto bello ascoltarvi. Mi chiamo Donata Columbro, sono una giornalista che si occupa di dati e di femminismo dei dati, anche grazie al lavoro di Catherine D'Ignazio e Lauren Klein, ma sono anche un'attivista per gli open data e quindi anche tutto il lavoro che ha fatto Sarah Williams e il suo libro sono stati fondamentali come ispirazione. E la domanda che ho qui è un po', mi trovo a metà, no, tra il mio essere giornalista e attivista, e ruoli che è sempre difficile separare. Penso alla situazione dei dati pubblici e degli open data che abbiamo in Italia, in particolar modo penso ai dati di genere, ai dati che riguardano la salute della donna, la possibilità di accedere a un aborto sicuro. Trovare questi dati come giornalista, come attivista è sempre molto complicato, cioè il lavoro che dobbiamo fare come giornalisti è veramente al di là pure di una competenza che dovrebbe essere quella solo del giornalista che cerca le storie dentro i dati. Dobbiamo avere competenze tecniche e va benissimo imparare, ma in qualche modo se devo cercare dati, no, sulla violenza che viene fatta contro le donne, è quasi di nuovo esercitata una violenza nel non mettere a disposizione davvero questi dati. E io quello che mi chiedo, ho un'idea ma non so appunto cosa ne pensate voi, mi chiedo se per avere dati di questo tipo l'unico modo sia avere i counter data, quindi avere organizzazioni dal basso che li raccolgono. Penso al conteggio dei femminicidi in Italia, non esiste una banca dati ufficiale, un registro dei femminicidi. Il Ministero dell'Interno dice che è una parola che si presta a interpretazioni, quindi noi non la usiamo, dicono nei loro report, e quindi abbiamo gli archivi di non una di meno che offrono mensilmente appunto il conteggio. E la domanda è, ma per tutta una serie di dati, proprio per le loro caratteristiche, gli unici dati che sarà possibile avere o che insomma dobbiamo arrenderci che l'unico modo è avere i controdati, dati dal basso, oppure dobbiamo anche usare il nostro potere per chiedere alle istituzioni che siano loro a raccoglierli e metterli a disposizione in modo davvero trasparente e con accesso libero per tutti e tutte?
Oh my gosh, that's such a hard question because you cannot guarantee that those same governments will not, the next legislative or the next sort of regime will not use that very same data for the reverse purposes, right? And we're seeing this in the United States right now. Like, had there been a data set of people getting abortions in states where abortions are now illegal, evidently our new president is going to come after those women. So we absolutely would not want a data set to do that thing. So I think, you know, to your larger point, I think it is a tricky question. I think that the thing that we can feel more confident about is if the data resides, the people who create the data within their own community for their own purposes are the ones who keep and protect that data. And that's actually something that Catherine has talked a lot about in her new book, about how even in her tools, they never take the data or aggregate the data from the individual groups. They let the data sit there and bring their tools to the data. So that's an interesting sort of infrastructural but also political point. But the other thing that I'll say, and we sort of need to think about this on two levels. So one is there are very real harms. You absolutely need to be thinking about not just current harms, but future harms, especially in the case of data that documents some sort of sensitive experience or identity feature or anything like that. On the other hand, it is really important to think about the multiple ways that you can challenge power. And here, there's a sort of this model that comes to us from Latin American activists in general, not just data activists, but this idea that you can sort of like challenge power within the system, challenge power, sort of push back against power from outside of the system, and then also imagine your alternative configurations of power. And those are three different forms of activism. And again, they're not mutually exclusive. We need people doing all three of those things, always, all the time. And you could be doing one or two or three, but everyone, ideally collectively, someone will be doing all of those things. And so thinking about whether or not there would be a form of data that could be collected by a government that would not expose the individuals or communities to harm, that would work in the service of more detailed or more granular data that contains more of the evidence that you actually need in order to better represent the people. That would also be something that you could think about, right? Whether it was regional data or anonymized data, I'm not really sure, you've thought more about this issue than I have, but things like that, right? So thinking about like, well, this might be different data sets for different purposes, but maybe we could use both of them.
Yeah, I really think, chapter 2 of my book is all about collecting data. And I think in the presentation I showed you that, we often start with a question, and I often find that the data doesn't exist to answer my question. And I believe building data or counter data is one of the really great ways that we can challenge power dynamics. And so I think almost all my projects, we build data sets. And we have partnered many times with journalists in order to expose the issues that we find in the data. Actually, we partnered with the New York Times several times to collect data on air quality, also on issues around migration. And so I think, as you know, as journalists, historically, you take data that already exists and then translate that data for the public to understand. And in fact, the several times that we've worked with the New York Times on collecting data, it was really it felt very out. For them, it was very nerve-wracking because they never collect their own data. They always, take data that's already existing and represent it. And I think for them, that's why they partnered with us, because we are, let's say, the data collectors, and we can vouch for its accuracy and authenticity or kind of scientific methods that we use to collect the data. And so I think that's one really important thing to think as a journalist. How do you make sure that your data is verified in some way so that when you're presenting it to the public, you have some sense of that this data is representative of the thing that you're trying to describe. So anyways, I'm getting into multiple things here, but I want to go back to Lauren's point, which is that I think absolutely lots of community groups create their own data set and use those as a form of empowerment. And they often happen outside of government, let's say, preview. And I think that's often a good thing because of the way that data can be controlled by the communities and who create that information. So having the government create the data isn't always always the best way to go about it. But I mean, at the same time, it's a double-edged sword, right? In that we do need that publicly generated data to answer so many important policy questions. So isn't it their responsibility to do so? And, you know, in some cases, yes, in some cases no. But I think about, you know, like in the case of the informal transit, like why aren't the governments creating data on that? It's highly political. They don't want to be responsible for these transit systems. So if they were to create data on it, they would automatically become responsible for it. And so that's why we often have to create data outside of those formal channels.
Sarò brevissima per lasciare spazio alle altre domande. Sono Marcella Corsi, sono un'economista femminista, sono una data feminist da molto tempo. Sono qui anche con alcune delle mie studenti, speravo infatti che le domande venissero direttamente da loro, visto che si sono intimidite, la faccio io per loro. Abbiamo seguito da vicino il nuovo libro di Catherine su Counting Femicide, anzi ho portato la mia classe ad uno degli eventi organizzati anche intorno al 25 novembre proprio dal loro gruppo per quanto riguarda il rapporto con i social media e quindi l'uso dei media sia per creare dati che per creare controdati, a seconda di chi ovviamente si prende il carico di portare questo tipo di informazioni nella costruzione dei dati e nella rimozione delle mancanze di dati. Poi ieri abbiamo anche incontrato Sara Med, che è in questo momento a Roma per presentare il suo manuale della femminista Guastafeste, il Killjoy Handbook, e anche lei ha portato all'attenzione sempre delle nostre studenti il tema di come lo dico in inglese perché in questo momento non mi viene la traduzione in italiano, i complaints sono dei missing data, quindi torniamo ovviamente al tema dei missing data che il vostro libro ha sottolineato così bene. Quindi volevo riportarvi un attimo, perché a un certo punto è apparsa la faccia di Zuckerberg in una delle vostre slide, ma non l'abbiamo forse affrontata così direttamente, quindi qual è il ruolo o quale può essere il ruolo dei social media nel generare le informazioni utili per creare indicatori che ci mancano, per portare alla luce fenomeni che non riusciamo a monitorare attraverso le informazioni statistiche, i dati di cui disponiamo, ma anche ovviamente come possiamo in qualche modo attrezzarci tutte insieme per difenderci da questi monopoli e dalla capacità di questi soggetti di manipolare le informazioni. Ovviamente sono molto preoccupata per voi, per il ruolo che Elon Musk sta prendendo nella nuova amministrazione Trump, ma ovviamente la preoccupazione per voi riguarda tutte noi. Non potevo andare via qui oggi senza averlo nominato, il diavolo in persona. Grazie.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about it. This is something I talk about in chapter 3 of my book quite extensively, in that, you know, social media data is obviously heavily biased, and it's really hard to use it to explain any. Okay, it's very hard to use it to explain a phenomenon other than what's happening in social media, right? Because you can only describe what people who are interacting with social media are doing and what they're posting. And so You know, it's interesting when social media came out, there was Twitter studies, hack studies, you know, like all these, like, you know, how you can now crowdsource data. But I think it's really hard to create a data set that is unbiased from social media. But you can create a data set about what people are saying on social media and how that conversation is changing the way that we have larger political conversations and narratives. And I think that's maybe where it becomes the most impactful, is that we see biases in trends, misinformation, and we can really use the social media data to say that. And a lot of the projects where I am creating missing data, you know, we've had experiments where like maybe we can use social media or others. It never can really do it, because you have to verify that data from the larger community, and it's always missing people within. So it's to try to use it for missing data is hard because it's missing a lot of people from it. But I do think as we begin to experience the acts of our new government, that it is important for us to analyze the conversations happening on social media, because they are becoming more dominant than other kinds of information. And it can help us highlight maybe some of the trends and problems that we're seeing in society now.
I don't have a good answer to this question. We're in a terrible time. I mean, I think, you know, just to sort of affirm a couple of things that both of you have said, social media has historically been incredibly important for mobilizing around issues, for amplifying the work of the complaint, and for bringing together and spreading knowledge that people individually thought was a thing that was only happening to them or that they only cared about. And the dismantling of Twitter is a real loss for the way activism has transformed and really seemed like it had solidified in the past 10-ish years, right? And I don't think anyone really knows what to do now, right? Because Twitter is not what it was. Blue Sky. It is X. I refuse to use that word. It's so that's and you know, and there's, you know, some people have gone to Blue Sky, but that doesn't have the same. I mean, it has a real, to Sarah's point, has a real imbalance in terms of who's represented there. And yeah, you know, what we know from past oppressive and repressive regimes is that you need people to publicly and insistently make demands of people in power and do what they can to have them resonate. And, you know, I don't know if this means that we need to be doing more in public spaces, outdoors. I don't know if we just need to be having meetings like this one every day, or all being on group text on Signal. Like, I don't really know what the right answer is right now, and I think we're all asking the same questions, but it's really worrisome, honestly, because, you know, one of the things that, for example, that Sarah Hoffman's work has shown us, and it's like, it's amazing, like, oh, she's here, maybe did I see her on the street? I never know. But it's like, well, we know it is so important to give voice to the problems that people are facing, because that is how the line in the sand is drawn, or the certain marking of the issue, how that is initiated, and you need a process that can amplify that and elaborate that and have it spin out into sort of pushing back and envisioning alternatives. And I don't have confidence that we have a tech platform right now that will allow, or at least a unified one that will allow us to do that. So, sorry.
Sabrina, possiamo dal mio, altre domande? Poi? È lo stesso, serve come volete. No, come volete. No, cioè, lo stesso.
Allora, io sono una sociologa che ha lavorato fino a 2 mesi fa nel settore pubblico, nel Prime Minister Office, e sono occupata negli ultimi 3 anni di open government, politiche di open government, perché l'Italia è membro dell'Open Government Partnership iniziato dal governo Obama nel 2011. Non è un caso che i think tank e le good lobby sono partner attivi di questa community nazionale in Italia e che questo tema della pericolosità, ma anche opportunità rappresentate dall'intelligenza artificiale per un paese come l'Italia, dove le problematiche legate all'equity, non soltanto di genere, ma anche intergenerazionali, sono molto sentite. E la mia domanda è relativa a quali alleanze sono necessarie perché un Data Feminism in Action acquisti una capacità trasformativa realmente, perché sappiamo che è molto importante che tutte le politiche pubbliche siano evidence-based, cioè il tema della evidenza empirica delle politiche pubbliche è ormai diffuso in tutti i paesi occidentali. Non si possono fare politiche pubbliche se non avvalendosi di dati che dimostrino non soltanto l'esigenza di quella politica, ma anche la potenziale capacità trasformativa di quella politica. Quindi, posto che siamo tutti d'accordo, almeno tutti quelli che sono qui, e anche in parte il governo italiano, perché se il Prime Minister Office di questo paese decide di essere membro attivo di una partnership come l'Open Government, che ha tra i suoi valori fondamentali l'utilizzo di open data e l'uguale, diciamo, possibilità di dare voce alla società civile attraverso la società civile organizzata e al governo nel decidere politiche importanti. Chiudo dicendo che nel nostro piano nazionale per il governo aperto, che è in atto adesso, uno degli obiettivi è legato, proprio definito insieme a Period e ad altre organizzazioni della società civile, di avere una voce verso il governo italiano rispetto all'uso dell'intelligenza artificiale che in questo paese si sta preparando. Noi, come tutti i paesi europei, dipendiamo molto dal ruolo della Commissione europea, dalla Act che è stato emanato, e voglio ricordare a tutti che c'è la consultazione in corso fino al 10 dicembre. La Commissione europea ha fatto una consultazione sulle Act e quindi contribuire chi è in grado, chi non sente il problema della literacy, perché capisco che è difficile avvicinarsi a un tema del genere. Però la mia domanda a voi, vista proprio a livello universale, è quali sono le alleanze sulle quali bisogna spingere perché il Data Feminism in Action diventi una realtà. Se conoscete e vi avvalete dei collegamenti con l'Open Government nel vostro paese, Trump o non Trump, perché comunque in questo momento il governo americano è dentro lo steering committee a livello mondiale, sono 75 paesi che partecipano all'Open Government. Quindi lo dico Giulia, perché lo credo veramente, tutto questo ha molto valore, ma solo se riusciamo a avere un costante collegamento e pressione sulle decisioni delle politiche pubbliche, dei governi, perché costruire dati è costoso, richiede risorse umane e finanziarie, intelligenza collettiva, motivazione. Quindi non possiamo farlo come società civile, lo dico oggi, ma lo dicevo ieri come governo, da soli, bisogna farlo insieme. Quindi cosa pensate voi? E se posso fare una seconda domanda, cosa pensate dell'Act europeo, cioè quello che si sta dicendo l'Europa?
Irene, vuoi venire a fare tu anche la domanda, così le raccogliamo tutte? We gather the last question, so you can have a final answer. Yeah. Per chi non era, cioè per chi è a casa collegato, diciamo, prima della domanda che si sta per fare era una collegata a quali alleanze le autrici pensano siano necessarie per poter rendere il femminismo dei dati in azione una realtà, e qui in questo citando anche il ruolo del contesto dell'open government a livello internazionale che era stato avviato dall'amministrazione Obama.
E innanzitutto è stato veramente un grandissimo piacere potervi ascoltare oggi e un grande privilegio essere qui, quindi grazie mille. E io sono Irene Bedosti, sono una giovane ricercatrice e scienziata politica, ho da poco cominciato a far parte anche di Period, quindi per questo poi oggi sono qua. E avevo una domanda forse meno tecnica, ma che deriva più magari dalle mie esperienze e anche dai miei dubbi in questo momento diciamo, in cui mi affaccio anche al mondo della ricerca e dell'advocacy. E mi chiedevo in particolare, avete entrambe nominato il tema della interdisciplinarità e del ruolo che ha all'interno appunto anche del femminismo dei dati. In questo senso ho notato appunto che molto il vostro lavoro si applica poi giustamente in diversi contesti molto diversi tra loro, in particolare notavo il lavoro sulle migrazioni. E in questo senso mi chiedevo qual è la rilevanza che magari un background o comunque un approccio etnografico o sociologico possono avere per supportare poi il lavoro sui dati, diciamo, in termini poi più quantitativi. E quale può essere anche il miglior modo proprio di convogliare magari appunto un approccio di questo tipo, più sociologico, più legato anche alla contestualità e alle specificità di ogni contesto, per poi ottenere anche un lavoro più efficace nel momento in cui si parla di big data. Grazie.
Okay, maybe I can answer. Maybe I can answer both questions, maybe with one answer. I'll attempt. So when we're thinking about using data for action, I really believe the interdisciplinary nature of that work is important because it allows us to enter many different groups and of people who are advocating for change, right? So oftentimes when we're working in policy, just take migration policy as an example, we are very self-referential. It's policy people who know the migration issue. They are reproducing reports around migration that everybody in that field knows and sees. But when we break the boundary of that particular, let's say, field and start to think about it within presenting it to art and bringing it to the broader public, connecting with journalists and bringing them into the conversation, connecting them with government organizations. We start that conversation in multiple different layers that allows for the kinds of change that we want to see in the world. And I think what I'm talking about is in order to create change, we need to have a civic debate that forces government to create those changes that we want to see. If one community is only having that debate internally against self, it can't build that change or build that momentum. And so why interdisciplinary research is so effective in creating change is because you're bringing that conversation to many different avenues and building the momentum that helps force the change that we want to see. But it also allows us to approach the idea from different angles that we maybe never thought about before, right? So when we're thinking about migration policy, we're often, we are very self-referential. When we see it from another person's perspective and then address that change from their point of view, we are allowing ourselves to translate the idea into multiple avenues as well. And I think that's why it's so important. And that gets back to the original question of what kinds of people do we need to work on these issues? We need to make alliances with many different groups and organizations in order to see the change we want to see. And I think that means also bringing in government in the conversation. I think every project that we work on using data for action, I reach out to everybody whether they are a community group advocating for it or a government agency, and I invite them to participate with me on the project because I think by being inclusive, even within the power structures, you are allowing people to trust you. So I'm not untrustworthy to the government, and I'm not untrustworthy to the community group working on it. And I think an example of that is in the Nairobi case, like when we were building the data on the informal transit system, I invited government officials to help us, to build it with us, to help us co-build this data set. And because I created the invitation on every level, everyone trusted the data. So if we are going to build change, people need to trust us. And trust is so important in data analysis. So in this case, because we invite everybody on the team and they understand our process and they trust us, they can trust the advocacy that we're making, whether it comes from the government or to the opposite. And so that's what I would say is engage all people in order to see this change that you want to see in an equal way.
That's amazing. Thank you. I don't have much to add, except that I will say that, what we have learned over, again, decades, centuries of various struggles for equality and for freedom is that political change always comes through alliances. And those alliances are often uneasy, and they are very often also temporary, and they are pragmatic, right? And I think that it's important to separate the sort of expedient political alliances that are made from what sustains movements, which is community, right? And those are two equally crucial sources of positive momentum. And one is sort of a pragmatic and policy-oriented relationship that can be undone at a later date. But it is so important to remain accountable to the community that you are coming from, that you are working to support, because ultimately, we know from groups that are working together who identify shared goals that they do not share everything, and there will come a time when the end of their shared goals or the limits of their shared goals will become apparent, and then the question becomes, where do you go back to? How do you rebuild trust? How do you rebuild interest and activity? And it all just comes from community. And so I think, especially in the United States, the messaging that, at least I personally and in the groups that I am a part of have been receiving, which I think is true, which is as we prepare for the next administration, to build up as much and as strong community ties as you can, so that when we are required to return to those communities for support and protection, we know that we can trust them, that they are in place. But I think that I appreciate your question, because I think that it will go from being a hypothetical one to a real one very, very soon.
And I think one important point to add here is that, between the private institutions and the government institutions, there are lots of power dynamics. And these institutions that weave those two together, whether it's Prime Minister, the lobby, period, all of that work that you are doing is actually translating between these two kind of dominant power structures. So it's so important to have these groups doing that, because if we don't have those institutions within society, we are not creating those checks. And so academia is a real important component to that, because we work in between these two dominant power structures, as well as all of the groups and organizations that are represented here today, and we need to keep doing that work.
Thank you.
Sì, arrivo. Sì. E volevo solo dire una cosa brevemente, visto che è stata citata la consultazione pubblica della Commissione sull'intelligenza artificiale, sui sistemi che possono appunto causare danni, che stiamo partecipando in realtà con la rete diritti umani digitali, e stiamo coordinando questo processo anche assieme a Period con The Good Lobby, proprio nell'ottica, grazie per averci citato anche rispetto alla partecipazione a Open Government Partnership, che è un percorso in cui crediamo molto, stiamo cercando di mettere a disposizione appunto delle competenze e questa capacity che in parte abbiamo, non siamo enormi, però occupandoci di questi temi e avendo comunque più dimestichezza con questo tipo di procedure, abbiamo molto piacere di raccogliere degli input se ci dovessero essere, sia per questo percorso specifico, per questa azione specifica, ma anche in maniera più ampia rispetto alla rete dei diritti umani digitali che citavo prima, perché è molto importante che, a proposito di alleanze, che siano sempre di più le organizzazioni rappresentative anche di comunità marginalizzate che aderiscono, no, a questa rete in modo tale che sia possibile rappresentare tutti i diritti, perché questo sarà fondamentale, come dicevo prima, alla luce dell'implementazione di questo regolamento, no, sull'intelligenza artificiale. Vi faccio un esempio concreto e anche in ottica intersezionale. Uno dei temi su cui stiamo cercando di lavorare è quello delle migrazioni, perché c'è un problema, no, rispetto anche a quello che ha stabilito, a quello che ha reso in parte possibile questo regolamento, che è la sorveglianza biometrica, l'utilizzo di questi sistemi e soprattutto le eccezioni che sono state fatte rispetto all'uso di questi sistemi ai confini, per cui è possibile utilizzare appunto queste tecnologie in maniera, diciamo, molto più spinta. E quello che stiamo cercando di fare è di lavorare anche con delle organizzazioni che si occupano di accoglienza migranti per cercare di rendere più, appunto, per cercare di in qualche modo sensibilizzare rispetto all'utilizzo di queste tecnologie, che cosa si può fare, cosa possiamo fare insieme. Quindi volevo chiudere con un invito. Adesso appunto vedo che ci sono diverse persone che magari possono essere qui sia a titolo personale o magari perché invece sono rappresentative, rappresentano altre organizzazioni, altri gruppi, di tenerci in contatto rispetto al lavoro, insomma, che faremo, che stiamo facendo. Ecco, grazie.
Grazie Martina. Allora per chiudere questa mattina super intensa cominciamo da un grandissimo applauso per Lauren Klein e Sarah Williams. Grazie davvero di cuore per il vostro lavoro intanto e per la volontà di essere qui con noi, perché questo ciclo di eventi non ci sarebbe potuto essere se voi non foste state disponibili a raggiungerci adesso qui in Italia, quindi grazie davvero di cuore. Volevo ringraziare, anche se non è fisicamente qua, Thais Rula de Alda di Digital Femmes Barcellona, con cui abbiamo iniziato il percorso a Bologna il 5 dicembre. Quindi volevo insomma ricapitolare per chiudere un po', diciamo, la parte dei ringraziamenti. Prima faccio solo una battuta velocissima, perché vi ho citato all'inizio, no, la delibera che facciamo su Dati per contare, anche collegata a uno dei temi che è venuto fuori, ma vorrei enfatizzarlo perché è vero che abbiamo, no, una grandissima ruolo e importanza nel costruire i nostri dati, nel creare il nuovo sistema, come governarli, però abbiamo le nostre istituzioni, noi lo vediamo lavorando con i comuni, e questo per esempio nell'ultimo capitolo del libro Data Action di Sarah Williams, che sempre di più per una serie di servizi fanno accordi con i privati e con aziende, che molto spesso raccolgono tutta una serie di dati su di noi. Pensate alla mobilità, che siano bici elettriche, auto elettriche o mille altri tipi di servizi, e poi questi dati non li restituiscono alle istituzioni. Per cui c'è anche un tipo però di consapevolezza dell'istituzione pubblica di dover regolamentare questo, di chiedere i dati, di avere degli accordi stringenti, per cui non diventino patrimonio di privati, dati che ci riguardano, che servono per costruire politiche più eque. Su questo noi cerchiamo di sensibilizzare e fare advocacy, però è importante che lo facciamo, e qui riguarda la multidisciplinarietà. Noi stiamo cercando di portare, no, il femminismo nei dati, i dati nel femminismo, ma è importante lavorare in maniera intersezionale, per cui ogni realtà, qualsiasi tema vi stia a cuore, bisogna coinvolgere i vari ambiti rispetto ai dati, all'importanza di usarli, a leggerli in un certo modo, come ci hanno descritto loro, non lo ripeto, però servono proprio le alleanze in tantissimi settori, sia nella società civile, con l'accademia, per premere, perché se non c'è una domanda politica forte le cose non possono diciamo cambiare, perché ci hanno spiegato bene loro che servono tantissimi soldi e tantissima volontà politica per fare tutto questo, quindi se non creiamo la spinta perché lo facciano, il sistema da solo non la farà. Quindi questa ci riguarda, insomma, da vicino e richiede una grande responsabilità comune per costruire, come diciamo prima, una società migliore per tutte le persone. Quindi ringraziamenti finali, titoli di coda che però vanno fatti, li farò insomma velocemente. Intanto parto da noi come femministe, quindi ringrazio intanto la squadra interna di Period, Valentina Bazzarin, Nordalelo, Chiara Bergamini, tutte le socie che sono qua, alcune le avete viste e hanno pure già parlato. Ringrazio anche Dylan Tartarini, il nostro tecnico, insomma, lato anche tecnico maschile, vogliamo alleati anche femministi. Quindi grazie mille a Martina Turola di The Good Lobby, Angela Laurenza per tutto il lavoro che abbiamo fatto insomma insieme per arrivare a questi risultati. Di nuovo ringraziamo l'Ambasciata statunitense per il contributo economico che ci ha permesso, a proposito di spese e soldi, di portare Sarah Williams e Lauren Klein qui con noi e poter avere questi momenti di confronto, quindi Raissa Brighi e di nuovo anche Karen Schinnerer, e speriamo davvero che questo sia un inizio di un percorso comune dalle varie sponde dell'oceano. Stiamo cercando di rafforzare il network in Italia, in Europa, ma è importante anche con chi fa il lavoro così importante che fanno Lauren e Sara oltreoceano e tante altre anche in Sud America. È molto importante che rafforziamo anche le reti internazionali, quindi ci auguriamo davvero che questo sia uno di tanti tasselli comuni di un lavoro che ci porterà insieme a realizzare un po' gli obiettivi e le visioni di cui abbiamo discusso oggi. Grazie anche a Silvia e Giovanna per interpretariato e a presto, grazie. E grazie anche a chi ci ha seguito da casa. Ah sì. Ultima cosa, chiediamo a chi ha preso le cuffiette per la traduzione interpretariale di lasciarle al tavolo in fondo. Grazie mille.